Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Bob Unger Show. We have a very, very special guest because any person running for office who has any type of congruence with the U.S. Constitution has to be special because he's so unusual, unfortunately. And he's running in the Republican primary. And what I found interesting, although it's troubling, is that all these Republicans that are in office in Iowa, where my guest, Kevin Virgil, is running, they have at best a 60% rating on the Constitutional Freedom Index.
Is it that high?
Yeah, I think one has a 60,
Yeah.
and I think the others have 50s. That's not very good.
50. I went to public high school, but 50 was not a good score when you grade on a scale of 100.
Well, it's funny you say that because they did a civics test on all the Ivy League colleges about 3 years ago, and the average score was 50 out of 100. And those are the Ivy League colleges.
Right.
So it gives you an idea of what's going on. And it's like Ron Paul told me one time, I was sitting at his table for dinner, and he said to me that there are so many Republican congressmen that still think we're on the gold standard. And that blew his mind that they don't even know that we haven't been on the gold standard for quite a while.
And I think Congress should require some sort of exam like we do for U.S. citizenship.
Exactly. So give us a little bit of your background, and then we'll get into where you stand on the various issues.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your show. So secondly, my background is I'm raised in a tiny little town, or actually on a farm outside of a tiny little town in Northwest Iowa. I graduated high school in 1991. Went to West Point after high school, graduated from there. And then I served a few years in the Army. For anybody who's familiar with the military, I started out in the 82nd Airborne as a young lieutenant and ended up serving in the Ranger Regiment after that. Left after my service commitment was complete to take a job with Merrill Lynch Investment Banking right across the street from the World Trade Center. And my last day there was in August 2001, which has been, so obviously I miss being in Lower Manhattan on 9/11 by a matter of days. And that was, it wasn't long after that, I had the opportunity to go serve my country again. So when I joined the CIA during the hiring binge after 9/11. So I served overseas for a while, and then ultimately left service for a second time, and ended up starting a business a few years ago in Washington, D.C., where I've been based, of selling software both to the private sector, but also to the Department of Defense and some other government agencies, which I suppose is like my first experience dealing with the federal bureaucracy from the outside. So anyway, I am no longer involved in a day-to-day. I'm still an owner, but I've also maintained a pretty close, arm's length relationship with Iowa politics. Just I'm out of casual interest, and for me, it was an issue. Everyone has that one issue, right? That every politician that converts them from a concerned citizen to an activist. For me, it was right now in the upper Midwest, we're dealing with companies that want to build carbon capture pipelines that have no clear public benefit, but yet want to enact eminent domain through their political connections to force private landowners, farmers and ranchers, to provide them easement rights against their will. And I've been fighting that, and that's how I got to know my former congressman, Steve King, who served in Iowa's 4th District.
I had breakfast with Steve King in Manhattan.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, so he served. Yeah, yep. Congressman King served our district for 18 years. And obviously there's a wide range of opinions about him out there, but nobody can deny that he maintained his oath to the Constitution and always fought for what he believed in and did it aggressively. And I've always admired that. And I intend to do the same. And unfortunately, what I've learned over the past couple of years, particularly while involved with this pipeline battle, is our current congressman, Randy Feenstra, who's now is wrapping up his second term in Congress, has no interest in maintaining that oath to the Constitution, as you already pointed out, his voting record indicates. And I am currently on a mission to make sure all the voters in my district are aware of his voting record, because he doesn't want to talk about it, and get a true constitutional conservative back in the chair representing Western Iowa.
Yeah, maybe you should get a copy of the Freedom Index and pass it around to people who care about the
Correct.
Constitution.
No, I am doing exactly that. So there are, yeah, a couple of different indices I track. One is the Republican Liberty Caucus, which is very similar, right? And I think the congressmen or the members who score well with the Freedom Index also do very well in the Liberty Index. And I watched both of them very carefully. And Randy Feenstra, I believe, scored a 50 out of 100. By the way, this is the most conservative district in Iowa, and it's one of the most conservative in the country. And we've got a sort of like unique position here, right? Because Iowa was obviously first in the nation in the presidential caucus. And we've got a real opportunity to punch, above our weight class, so to speak. And we certainly haven't been doing that here for the past 2 terms.
Gotcha. You mentioned West Point. Recently, I saw that they had a homosexual wedding at West Point, and I saw the cadets with their swords up in the air, forming a little line, and the bride and the bride, or the groom and the groom, went running through the gauntlet of the swords. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, this is West Point. I mean,
A lot has changed. There's and this is endemic across the military now, right? I mean, look, obviously I've got no problem, what people want to do in the privacy of their own home, but we're now, teaching critical race theory to cadets and midshipmen at the Naval Academy. We were using taxpayer dollars to teach people to hate each other. We've got West Point's currently grappling with like an affirmative action policy. The Supreme Court just ruled on. There are a lot of problems right now, top down with the military, which is why they're having such a hard time meeting recruiting targets.
yeah, I mean, lawyers now, you have to do continuing legal education in order to maintain your license. And in the continuing legal education, they violate the First Amendment in the most obvious way by forcing lawyers to listen to this crap about DEI and homosexuals. Now, if you're a Jew or a Christian or even a Muslim who believes in God's natural laws, as it talks about in the Declaration of Independence, your religion is being totally violated and vitiated by that forced, emphasized, taking of that course. And you have to listen to that crap in order to get your license. And the fact that they do that shows you that there is no pushback. And even the so-called decent people, quote unquote, in America, don't have the guts to push back anymore. We've lost all testicularity in men. And most men have become females, and I think the females have become men. And I don't think the president of China is looking at this and seeing cadets getting married to other cadets who are male and shaking in his boots over it. And I know in Israel, which I'm very familiar because I have a home there, they took the soldiers who were told to kick all the Jews out of their land and give it to Hamas. That was 2005, which resulted in what we saw on October 7th, they never could have done that if they weren't given that land and if they didn't forcibly throw 10,000 Jews out of their homes. And the soldiers were sent to re-education camps by the military so they could be desensitized to follow orders. And nobody has ever taught about the Nuremberg Code anymore, wherein these German committers of atrocities during the Holocaust tried to defend themselves by saying we were following orders. And the Nuremberg court said you cannot follow an immoral order, and they were executed. But now morality is out of the picture, and you just follow orders like a brain dead automaton.
Yeah, it's a very scary trend to think about with regard to the military, right? You want people to, you want your soldiers to have a strong moral foundation, right? Because like, look, some pretty heinous acts are committed by all sides whenever there's a war, in the name of whatever the people on the ground believe is right, and it's a horrible thing. You've got to have, you got to have soldiers with a strong moral foundation. Otherwise, you see what we had in My Lai in Vietnam, right, where lieutenant goes
Yeah,
on the record saying that he had to destroy the village in order to save it. I mean, that's just nuts. Um, and now I think we have, like you said, like with the DEI, which I think has been rammed down the American people's throats for some time now with increasing intensity. I think you're starting to see some blowback. Like we saw with I think Google is as a company is grappling with the fallout of DEI with this insane AI that they just released a couple of weeks ago that just humiliated the company. That's what happens when a product that is just nakedly politically correct gets released into the market, and nobody stands, like as you said, nobody stands up. Same thing, like as with the military, right? We are going to see some sort of wholly preventable catastrophe because we put the wrong people into a position of power, not because of merit, but because of whatever quota like the DEI commissars wanted to enact, and it's inevitably going to lead to a terrible outcome.
yeah. Well, we know that there has not been a legal war fought since World War II because there
Mhm.
has been no constitutional congressional declaration of war since World War II.
Right.
And if you watch the speech that G.W. Bush gave when he was talking about going back to war in the Middle East, he said, we're going in there. He didn't say to uphold the Constitution. He said to enforce a UN resolution. As far as I know, the Constitution gives the president zero power to enforce foreign resolutions. What do you think about that?
No, that's the whole point of the war powers resolution, right? I mean, how many wars? Look, if I just take into context the wars that America's initiated this century, and I mean every single one of them is ended in tears for us. Whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, now Ukraine, everything that's happening. Like now we've got an administration that's asleep at the switch, whose Secretary of Defense literally checked out without informing his boss for prostate surgery. Meanwhile, we've got we're one bad day away from having America involved in a hot war in Eastern Europe, in the Red Sea, and in southern Lebanon. It's a really really frightening place for us to be, and there's no. I fail to see how getting involved in any of these wars, or even just giving foreign aid and support, puts America first. I don't know why it's so hard for our legislators to put America first. It's almost become this pejorative. Like anybody who talks about America first is somehow like a racist, or is like
A
somehow naive.
Nazi, a racist, every
Yeah,
epithet under the
yeah.
sun. Yeah.
I mean, I think these days, and look, my predecessor, Congressman King, was run out of town on a rail out of DC because of a manufactured conversation where like what he said was taken out of context, and there was like a witch hunt that accused him of being a racist. I can assure you, having known him for quite a while, he's anything but. I mean, why would a racist endorse Vivek Ramaswamy for president over all the white guys who are running against him? But that being said, we're getting to the point now where, being called a racist by the left is a badge of honor because that means you're doing something right that they don't like.
Absolutely. It was interesting when the illegal United Nations, unconstitutional United Nations membership was finally voted for. They had tried to create the UN back in the days of World War I, the League of Nations. But the congressmen in those days, they understood that you'd be giving up U.S. sovereignty in order to do that. Which, by the way, why foreign aid is so terrible, even foreign aid to Israel. And I say that as a very strong Jew. Foreign aid to Israel is the worst thing you could ever do for Israel, because as George Bernard Shaw said, whoever pays the piper gets to call the tune.
Yeah, I've been to Israel 3 times, right? I mean, I've lived in New York for a long time. I have a very high level of affinity toward Israel, both as a Christian and just as somebody who's been there and has a lot of friends from there. But Israel has a lower debt to GDP ratio than America does at this point. We're $34 trillion in debt. Like, what the heck are we doing sending money to Israel right now when we've got crumbling infrastructure and a struggling doesn't even begin to describe what our middle class is going through right now. It doesn't make any sense. And yet, both of our senators here in Iowa just voted for a $95 billion boondoggle. They call it the border bill, but it was really the Ukraine bill because that's where the money's going. Like, foreign aid it doesn't put America first. But what it does, it certainly enriches our defense contractors and the ecosystem in the counties surrounding Washington, D.C. that have become insanely wealthy over the last 20 years, but it doesn't do anything for the people out here in Central Time.
That's right. I saw a very funny cartoon. It had a bunch of guys with the baby infant on their lap, and the infant had the face of Zelensky. And it said, "This tax time, claim him as a dependent."
I mean, isn't it interesting that the first thing that President Biden talked about last night in the State of the Union was Ukraine?
Yeah.
Didn't talk about our border, which, I mean, when you look at his family history related to that Ukrainian company, Burisma, and just how he's been on the wrong side of every foreign policy decision his entire life, I guess it's really not that surprising. It's sad, but it's not surprising.
Yeah, when I ran for Congress back in 2005, I debated a bunch of guys, and anybody who was there could tell you it wasn't exactly close. And in a straw poll, I think I got something like 90% of that large crowd. And yet the head of the Republican Party said about me, he's very articulate, but he can't be controlled. And he talks about the Constitution too damn much.
That's a bad thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right.
On Ukraine, I've done a lot of research on that, and I put together David Stockman, who had been Reagan's budget director,
Right.
with Bobby Kennedy Jr., because I had met with Kennedy in a friend's apartment, and they engaged in a fantastic discussion about the real history of Ukraine
Sure.
and the involvement in the coup there.
Yep.
And I don't know if you're aware, but they murdered in Ukraine a journalist friend of mine recently.
Gonzalo Lira.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm very aware of this story.
But
Amazing how, nobody's interested in talking about him,
nope,
an American citizen,
that's
murdered
right.
by the Ukrainian security services. It's unbelievable.
Gonzalo Lira was the greatest an analyzer of Israel that I have ever read. His articles and deep dives into Israel, and he was, pro-Jewish. In fact, I think he was Jewish, even though he has a Spanish name. It was absolutely phenomenal. This guy had such integrity. And it doesn't matter if you're a journalist and your political views are different. It shouldn't matter if you have integrity. Your political views should be absolutely irrelevant.
Right.
And with him, they were. In fact, he got hired and fired by the University of Pennsylvania because he was originally an anthropologist. And they fired him because he had been anti-Israel, because he believed some of the propaganda. But he's the type of guy that when he sees evidence, he changes his mind. And, that's
Imagine
rare.
that.
That is
Yeah.
rare, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. I respect a guy like Matt Taibbi, who is generically a liberal or a typical Democrat, but he has exposed so much dishonesty and fraud amongst the Democrats because he goes for the truth. And, he's always been an iconoclast. So
Why is that so rare amongst our journalists today? Why does all these journalists that are coming out of these journalism schools now, they just want to be activists, right? They don't want to report the truth. They want to push an agenda. And that's a yeah, it's not the root cause of our problem, but it's definitely part of the problem.
when I talk to some of these Jews around here, and they can't call me an anti-Semite, I they say, "Oh, Zelensky is a Jew." I said, "Really? He's a Jew? Then how come his government and his military has so many Nazis that are carrying actual swastikas on
Yeah.
their uniform?"
Which the New York Times photographers were like asking the soldiers to hide,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah. No, or that crazy story about the Canadian Parliament, when they had the old Ukrainian soldiers stand up.
Right.
Like anybody who knows anything about history knows that if you were Ukrainian and you were fighting the Russians in World War II, right? I mean, you were probably working with the Nazis.
Of course.
Uh, it's that just, I mean, talk about, I mean, just being completely ignorant to history. These people, it's unbelievable.
Well, look at what Clinton did to the Eastern Orthodox Serbs when he was bombing them, killing them. The Serbs were the only people that rescued Jews. In fact, many of the Jews rescued by them fought in the underground with them. And who did the Jews support? The majority, of course. Anytime I say any people, I'm only
Right.
talking about a majority, is obviously not everyone. Who did they support? They supported the enemy, the Bosnian Muslims, who were part of Hitler's Waffen SS, and they're on their side.
Yeah.
I always tell people that the Germans, if they didn't obey their orders, they would be killed. The Ukrainians killed Jews because it was fun. Big
Yeah.
difference. They enjoyed it. and these people are being portrayed as somehow these forlorn, woe-begotten victims.
It blows my mind. Look, I've spent a fair amount of time in that part of the world, and I'm old enough to remember, which means before 2014. The Western media used to talk about the Ukrainian government like it was just comically corrupt. Like Yanukovych, Yushchenko. The guy whose like face was disfigured when they poisoned him. I mean, politics in Ukraine has always been like a full contact sport. They play for keeps, and the corruption there it's always been shocking. But suddenly, after the neocon wing led by Victoria Nuland, who thankfully finally resigned, but as soon as they flipped the Ukrainian government in 2014, suddenly it's like we're dealing with like Pope John Paul II or something. I don't understand it. I don't, well, I do understand it, but it defied logic. There was, like, they suddenly stopped talking about the corruption, because now, like, they were using Ukraine as a puppet government to try to implement regime change against Putin.
Yeah. I mentioned before the Nuremberg Code, and of course, part of the Nuremberg Code relates to Dr. Mengele and the horrible experiments that he did on Jewish children in the camps. In fact, one of the guards in the camps was paid by Alfred Kinsey from the Kinsey
Yes, I've heard
sex
this. I've
report
heard this.
to
Yeah,
have sex with Jewish children, to rape them, and to report about it. And Kinsey also said that he documented orgasms in infants. How do you document an orgasm in an infant?
yeah.
A great book by Dr. Judith Reisman called Kinsey, Sex, and Fraud. And Kinsey is an idol in America, someone to
Yeah.
be admired. Last question, and then we're going to get into your basic platform. I watched these genuflecting, pusillanimous wimps in the Congress when Powell testified before them. And it amazes me, other than Ron Paul, nobody asks him a tough question. And they all go, "Oh, thank you for your service." Your service? That's like asking a rapist, "Thank you for your service. Can you give me more service?" I mean, nobody questions any of this. And nobody says what constitutional authority exists for the Federal Reserve to even exist,
Correct.
let alone run the world.
Yeah. Why can't you pass an audit?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Right.
Even what's his name co-sponsored the bill with Ron Paul. I think it was it Kucinich? I think it may have been Kucinich. Not exactly my favorite guy, but even
Sure.
he was in favor of auditing the Fed. And Congressman Mooney, who's pretty good from West Virginia, he asked Powell, have they expatriated gold to other nations now? How much has been expatriated? He refused to answer.
Yeah. Well, because nobody wants to know the answer.
Right.
Say what you will about Dennis Kucinich, but at least you know exactly where he stands on things, right? Yeah, of
Yeah.
course he's anti-war, but at least he's honest about it. Um, I don't understand why we have plenty of Kuciniches in Congress today. They just, they're hiding behind camouflage.
Yeah. So to sum up, what are a few of your priorities and how do you intend to push for it?
Well, I have one priority, for me at least, and that is the thing I care about the most, and I think will address all the other problems that we face, which is the decentralization of our federal government. That is the issue I singularly care about the most, and the one I intend to pursue the most aggressively. Right? We have we have a Congress full of members right now who have decided to ignore their oath to the Constitution and propose legislation that fails that litmus test over and over again, right? Like we just saw, here in Iowa, everybody's fired up about this bill the House voted on 2 days ago, like this House spending bill. Somebody snuck in an earmark that includes $15 million to start tracking cattle across the country. Like every small rancher and every small beef producer now, like if the government has its way, they're going to have to track movement of all their cattle, which obviously could be used if the government has that information, then could be used for all sorts of ends that are going to be detrimental to like small producers, right? Um, but there's just all these examples of how our federal government, certainly over the last 20 years, not argue since the post-war period, has grown and grown. It is increasingly an anchor on the U.S. economy, to the tune of $34 trillion. We have 3 million federal employees now. It's a number that hasn't changed since World War II. Meanwhile, the productivity of the average employee out in the private sector is such that one person today can do the work of, that 2.5 people could do 80 years ago, right? Because of technology, productivity increases. We've never asked that of our federal government. And the conversation, whenever it's on, like a morning talk show or on the Hill, nobody ever talks about, managing the expenses side of the of the federal government's income statement, right? They only talk about more money, more taxes, taxing the rich. Nobody ever talks about like real meaningful government reform, like mass layoffs. Like like when I used to sell to the DoD in my business, it was in widely held opinion in the federal government. Sorry, widely held opinion amongst defense contractors, rather, that you could lay off half the civilian workforce in the DoD and that organization would work better. And I believe that most likely applies to just about every federal bureaucracy we're dealing with. And now we're seeing signs increasingly, certainly over the last 4 years, and probably going much further back, that certain agencies are being weaponized against the American people. And if we don't do something about this soon, well, first of all, it's going to destroy our economy, and irreversibly destroy it, and it's going to change our culture forever. I firmly believe that we need to cut the federal workforce in half, and likely cut it in half again. But let's start with a 50% reduction across the board. And there are plenty of government agencies that are unconstitutional. Start with the Department of Education, which Representative Thomas Massey out of Kentucky had an amendment last year to close down. My opponent, Congressman Randy Feenstra, did not support that bill. So I don't know why, but yet he claims to be a conservative. So there are plenty of agencies that need to be shut down as well. And look, this won't happen overnight. This is going to be a generational fight, but we have to decide, what kind of country we want to be. If we really are a constitutional republic and a nation of laws, not of men, we need to return to our founding principles here, based on the 10th Amendment, that we need a federal government with substantially reduced power and authority. A lot of what the federal government does today needs to be pushed down to the states, like what we just saw with Roe v. Wade, like the rules on abortion are now pushed down to the states. I think that's the right place for that conversation to take place, as with all violent crime. But we as a nation have decided to centralize power in Washington for the last, several decades. And we're now in a place where, I moved to Washington, D.C. 20 years ago. And over the last 2 decades, I've watched it become extremely wealthy. 4 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America are in the immediate perimeter around there. And there are no factories there. Nobody's building anything. But you've got millions of snouts in the government trough that get first cut at that government budget, and everybody's getting wealthy from it. And meanwhile, out here in the heartland, small communities are being bled dry, and this is not the way forward for a successful nation, right? We are squandering everything that like my grandparents and the generations before fought and bled to build. And if we don't turn this around, and now, we're never going to have another opportunity to do it.
You got that. I mentioned before the Nuremberg Code.
Mm-hmm.
And last night I was watching with my wife a documentary on this woman who was an evil witch named Elizabeth Holmes from Theranos.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm familiar.
And obviously she had on her board of directors every Republican cabinet member.
George Shultz, right?
Yeah.
Jim Mattis, former Tech Def.
That's right.
Yeah, it was crazy.
And of course, the whole thing was a fraud and it didn't work.
Right.
So I turned to my wife and said, well, big deal. How is that any different than the poison vax that they forced us put in our arms with absolutely no proper testing, and also doesn't work?
Not only does it not work, it's hurting millions of people, and the government gave all the manufacturers an emergency use authorization, so there's no legal recourse. to go after them. It's now we're going to look back. History is going to look back at COVID as probably the biggest scam ever perpetrated against the American people. Um, absolutely, absolutely awful.
I interviewed all the best doctors, doctors that actually have integrity. Dr. McCullough, Dr. Malone. I interviewed the Surgeon General of Florida, Dr. Ladapo from Africa, who's fantastic. And these were the guys that were telling the truth, along with a few friends of mine who were MDs. And those friends of mine were all kicked out of their hospitals, doctors for 40 years, and kicked out because they opened their mouth
Yep,
and resisted.
that's right.
And this whole idea that there's an emergency clause in the Constitution that takes away your constitutional liberties if the government decides there's an emergency. Somehow, every time I read the document, I don't see that clause. And people just put up with it. It was like a test to see just what kind of sheep the people of this country have become.
Yeah, I think they're probably very happy with the outcome too, for the
Oh
most
yeah,
part.
yeah.
Sadly, sadly. Um,
Well,
and more in other parts of the country more than others. But yeah, no, I agree with your assessment on that.
yeah. Well, I'm glad to know you're a Christian because biblical Christians, as far as I'm concerned, I want every Gentile to be a biblical Christian because generally they won't murder Jews.
Yeah, I guess the question is, do Christians today want to be New Testament or do they want to be Old Testament? Because I think the problem we're seeing today here is that a lot of our Christian leaders always advise to turn the other cheek, like Jesus Christ told his followers to do. In the face of all this oppression that we're facing, we're being attacked on all fronts culturally, and dealing with brainwashing in our kids' schools and all this woke garbage we're expected to swallow in the workplace with DEI, all these oppressive laws being formed. New Testament Christians are advised to turn the other cheek at some point. Are we going to make the transition to Old Testament and decide it's time to go on offense and work hard to restore that Judeo-Christian social contract that this country was built upon? Because if we don't do that, like we're facing a communist onslaught right now. Like I see so many parallels right now to what the Bolsheviks did to Russia, 107 years ago. I mean, it's happening, right? I mean, it started in the academic institutions, and the product of all that brainwashing is now graduated from college and entering the workplace and scaring the devil out of all these corporate CEOs who are just basically throwing their hands up and letting these idiots do whatever they want. And if we don't stop it now, these kids are going to start, they're going to start becoming lawyers and doctors and airline pilots, and we got to start fighting back.
I just finished reading this book, Conformity Colleges by David Barnheiser, who I also interviewed. And you're quite right. And anything I can do to help you, I know I'm all the way over here in New York, I will do. And I want to get the word out about you because you're very impressive. And if you ask anybody who knows me, I don't patronize anybody. So if I say something good or bad, I actually mean it.
I have lived in New York City for a while, and I know that when an old Jewish guy compliments you, you have to take it very, very, very sincerely, and it doesn't happen that often. So I very much appreciate that. And I would say, first of all, having me on your show, it's been a huge pleasure and an honor. That's a great way to help. And if I could just plug my campaign right now, my Republican primary is on June 4th when I'm facing off against my opponent, Randy Feenstra. My district's a pretty safe Republican seat, so whoever wins my primary is probably going to win the general. So anybody who wants to learn about me, and if anybody wants to donate to my campaign, we certainly could use some help, getting the word out. So they can go to, my last name is Virgil, as in Virgil. Just go to virgilforcongress.com. You can see where I stand on the issues. I make a shout out to former Congressman Ron Paul on there, who I, first fell down and hit the rabbit hole with him back in 2008 when he was running. Never really looked back. So anyway, I certainly grateful to have support from you and or any of your listeners here.
Yeah, and I'll also be sending out a lot of emails. So even the ones that don't watch it on the internet will see it on the email. One of the things that has helped RFK is he is on every podcast because most of the media doesn't want to give him the time of day.
Sure.
So, try to get on every podcast you can because it's not just that particular audience, it's their friends and word of mouth. It's
Yeah.
kind of like a successful movie. In the old days, a movie would really become successful, not because of advertising, but because of word of mouth. And I used to be a lawyer for a senator and an assemblyman here in New York in the legislature. And I remember Assemblyman Doug Prescott. Of course, New York is different because it's much more amalgamated together. But he was a total underdog, but he worked his butt off. And I remember he hit every single door in the district, which is not easy to do because New York is a
Sure.
big place. But he did it. And that personal touch makes a big difference, as well as the interviews and the podcasts and the radio and whatever else you could do.
Yep.
And I'm going to try to see what national shows I could see if I could get you on. It's hard because a lot of these owners of these stations, even if they're Republican, they're establishment Republican, so they're going to generally support the incumbent.
Right.
It's like what
Yeah.
happened to Roy Moore, when he ran in
Sure.
Alabama, he didn't
Yep.
get endorsed. And generally the president is going to endorse whoever is the establishment guy, unless it's Nikki Haley or something like that.
Yeah. Right. Exactly right.
But Virgil, I didn't ask you, are you married with kids?
I am divorced, but I've got two kids. I've got a 12-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter.
Wow, great.
Yep.
I've got three, but I'm a lot older than you, that's for sure.
Yeah. No, I'm sure. Well, yeah, congratulations and all that. And thanks very much for having me here.
It's my pleasure and an honor, and you take care. God bless you.
All right. Thanks, Robert.
Okay, bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.